Welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason, and in today's video, we're going to be previewing the 2023 Saskatchewan Roughriders. And as always, let's begin with their previous season. And last year for Saskatchewan was nothing short of a major disappointment. They're expected to be one of the teams in the mix for the Grey Cup last year. They were hosting it in Regina, and quite simply, they just fell flat on their face. They had a decent start to the season, but they just had an all-out collapse the last two-thirds or so of the season, finishing with a 6-12 record and missing the playoffs. Extremely disappointing season. So this offseason was going to bring a lot of change to the organization, and we saw that over the offseason. So let's talk about it. So in terms of their offseason moves, I made a video of all of the offseason moves for every team in free agency a few months back, so go check out the video on the Roughriders for more details. But in terms of their biggest addition, it is obviously quarterback Trevor Harris, who they signed in free agency from the Montreal Alouettes. And I do think this is an upgrade over Cody Fajardo. I think that Trevor Harris is a much more trustable quarterback at this point of his career. It was a really good fit, I think, for Saskatchewan. I think that, they had just such a major need at the position. After Bo Levi Mitchell was off the market from Calgary, this was really the next best option, in my opinion. So they go ahead, they get their guy in free agency, and I think that Trevor Harris will definitely improve certain aspects of this team, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But at the end of the day, I think I do still have some concerns about that because his time in Edmonton in the West Division still lingers in my mind. I think that, I was saying this a few years ago when I was doing game recaps, that Trevor Harris is more of an East Division quarterback to me, and it just seems like, when he moved back out East, that's when he started, rejuvenating his career. So I worry that, playing in a tougher Western Division, that he will fall back a little bit, go back to where he was in Edmonton. Maybe not that low, maybe not as low as 2021 with Edmonton, but at the end of the day, I still do have concerns that he's not going to be able to match his level of play from last season in terms of getting wins, at least for this organization. So I'm very interested to see how Trevor Harris does in the West Division, but I do think logically it was a very good move for the Roughriders, considering their big need at the position. Now, in terms of their biggest loss, you can go a number of different ways with this because they did have a lot of roster turnover this season, but at the end of the day, I don't think there were too many core pieces that they lost, but one that will be missed, certainly from a leadership standpoint, is offensive lineman Dan Clark, who had been the team's longest tenured player, had played over 10 years for the organization, and was such a linchpin at that center position for them. Missed a ton of time last year, and that really showed with how they struggled on that offensive line. They struggled even when he did play, but they struggled even more when he was out of the lineup. So I think losing that veteran presence in terms of leadership capabilities, I think that is worth noting here for the Roughriders. They do lose other guys like Duke Williams, Shaq Evans in the receiving core, other guys along the offensive line, as well as other players on the roster. But at the end of the day, I think in terms of the leadership capabilities, Dan Clark is the biggest loss for them because I don't think that they really had that core player that they lost in free agency this year. I think a lot of the pieces that they lost were relatively expendable. Now let's talk about the roster. And, Roughriders fans may get angry at me for how low I have this team ranked in terms of these rankings here, but at the end of the day, I just don't think that they compare that well in comparison to the rest of the CFL, despite their changes this offseason. So for offense, I have them ranked 8th in the CFL, and this is definitely not due to the quarterback. I have Trevor Harris ranked as the third best quarterback in the CFL going into this season. But at the end of the day, that only goes so far. I think the wide receiver core outside of Keon Schaefer-Baker is not too special. I think the offensive line is still an issue despite the additions of Peter Godber and Philip Blake in the offseason. I don't think those guys are going to fix their woes entirely. I think the unit will be improved. It definitely can't be as bad as it was last year, which was worse than the 2019 BC Lions offensive line, which was notoriously beat up on. But at the end of the day, I don't think they've improved a substantial amount, and I still think it is the worst offensive line in the CFL, so that drags down their ranking here. I think the running backs are okay, but I think the wide receivers and the offensive line, like I said, are what drags that ranking down for me on the offensive side of the ball. And then on defense, I have them ranked 7th. They're very close to those 6th and 5th teams, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, I think that, there's just more difference-making players on those other teams, and that's why I put those teams above Saskatchewan in the ultimate ranking here. But at the end of the day, you still have a lot of playmakers on that defense. Anthony Lanier stands out as a great defensive tackle that hopefully stays healthy this season. Only played about 10 games last year, but was a beast in those games. You had Larry Dean having a great comeback season last year at the linebacker position. Probably going to start Canadian at linebacker, that other linebacking spot this year, and Micah Tights, who comes back from injury. The secondary, I have a few questions about. There's some inexperienced players back there, and of course you have the controversial Nick Marshall, who can get beat for a big play 1 minute and then have a game-sealing interception the next. So you never know what you're going to get out of him. But at the end of the day, I think that it's a pretty good defense in Saskatchewan, despite the ranking I have it here. I just think that the other defenses I have ahead of them are just slightly better going into this season, at least on paper. Now, in terms of Canadian talent, I do have them ranked a bit higher, and I have them at number 5 in the CFL. And this is largely due to having Keon Schaefer-Baker on the roster, who I consider one of the true blue-chip Canadian players in the CFL. Just such a dynamic young receiver, and should only get better as he gets more experience in the league. I think that, the offensive line has some pieces that could develop into solid players on that offensive line, but at the end of the day, I think that's why it doesn't rank higher to me in the CFL in terms of Canadian talent. But I think that Keon Schaefer-Baker being one of the potential superstars as a Canadian player in the CFL, that's why it ranks as high as it does for me. There's other players on the roster as well that I'm going over, but Micah Tights, like I mentioned before, is a really good Canadian linebacker, but Keon Schaefer-Baker, really the star of the show in terms of their Canadians on this roster, and a big reason why it ranks 5th for me. Now, in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, I think that one of their biggest strengths could be that pass rush with Anthony Lanier, like I said. They always seem like they get a lot out of their defensive ends as well. Pete Robertson had a really good, strong first half of last year. We kind of tailed off towards the end. I think in the first half last year, he probably was the front runner to be most outstanding defensive player, but again, tailed off towards the second half of the season. You want to see more consistency from him, but still a very talented player and should produce this year in the CFL, and I'm really interested to see how that pass rush does this season. I think it could be the reason why they win some games this season. And then I think the quick passing game with Trevor Harris coming on board could be a big addition for this team and a big strength for them. Trevor Harris, never been a fan of holding the ball too long. You saw him do a little bit of that more in Montreal, but at the end of the day, most of the time, he's going to be getting the ball out quick. And I think with a guy like Keon Schaefer-Baker, who's a yards after the catch threat, Darrell Walker kind of has a skill set that he can create yards after the catch as well. So I think that this is going to be something that the Rough Riders utilize early and often this season, especially to protect that relative weakness that they have on the offensive line, like I was mentioning before, which I have as their biggest weakness going into this season. I think that specifically the tackle positions could be problematic yet again for this team. You bring in Philip Blake, who does have some versatility to play tackle as a Canadian player in this league, but certainly not an above average starter at that position. Can kind of just hold his water at that spot. So very interested to see how this team performs at the tackle position this season, and if this offensive line sees a major improvement and outperforms my expectations. But for me, it's a weakness. And then another weakness, when I was looking through their stats from last year, was the run defense. And when I looked at all the other players that they brought in this offseason, I don't see that improving in a dramatic way. They averaged giving up 5.5 yards per carry last season as a defense, so you really can't have that. Honestly, I think that could be a big reason why they lose games this year and why they lost games last year down the stretch. So at the end of the day, I think that's something that needs to be addressed within this defense, because I don't think that they brought in the guys that are necessarily going to be the solution to that. I think Anthony Lanier Don't have the stats about how they performed run defense wise when he was on the field versus when he was injured. But I think that maybe having him back will help in terms of the run defense for this team. But at the end of the day, that could be a weakness to look out for the Rough Riders this season. And ultimately, those are just some of the reasons why I think they're going to win games and lose games in 2023. Now turning over to talk about their opening schedule to the season. So week 1, they're at Edmonton. Should be a fascinating game. Edmonton did take a game off them last year, but of course, Edmonton is playing a dreaded home game here that, obviously the curse. Let's see if it keeps going week 1, but should be very interesting to see if Edmonton gets that home win and upsets Saskatchewan in the first game of the season. Really wouldn't even consider that an upset because Edmonton's improvements this offseason. Week 2, they're versus Winnipeg. Always a very fun matchup when these two teams get together. Week 3, they're at Calgary. Should be a very important game for this team. Establishing themselves early in the season is going to be very crucial after they, finished the season very poorly last year. So getting off to a good start, I think, is going to be very important for Saskatchewan this season. Then week 4, they have a bye week, followed by week 5, they play against Edmonton at home this time. So 2 games against Edmonton in the first 5 weeks of the season should be very interesting to see. Could be a big determinant whether or not one of those teams make the playoffs versus the other. And then week 6, they're playing Calgary again. So 2 times playing Calgary, 2 times playing Edmonton in the first 6 weeks of the season. So those matchups will be very crucial to determining whether or not they, put themselves on the path for a playoff push this season. So at the end of the day, I think that is a very important slate of games to begin the season for the Rough Riders because these are all Western Division games. Usually you see the CFL stack the early slate with, cross-conference games, but this year they're doing a little bit differently, as you can see with the Rough Riders schedule, and that's their slate to begin the year. Now, in terms of my expectations for this team this year, I have them finishing between 7 and 10 wins, which may be disappointing for Rough Riders fans to hear, but at the end of the day, I think that even with the improvement at quarterback, I think that the weakness along the trenches and the offensive line could hold them back ultimately and force them to have one of the worst records in the CFL again. But I also could see this working to a slight degree, getting slightly above 500 record with 10 wins. I think that, we haven't seen the massive improvements from this team like you've seen from other teams in the CFL this offseason, but I think the improvement at quarterback could make a big difference. But like I said, that factor with Trevor Harris moving out to the West is drawing a lot of questions for me, and that's why I'm hesitant to say this team's going to go 12-6, 11-7 this year. But ultimately, this is going to be one of the more fascinating teams to follow in the CFL this season, given the way they finished their season last year. So very interested to see what happens with the Rough Riders in 2023. But you guys will have to let me know what you guys think down in the comment section about their chances of returning to the playoffs and potentially winning the Grey Cup in 2023. And with that said, hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.